Um, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Heather Gill-Frerking, and I come at heritage from an unusual perspective. I have a doctorate in biological anthropology, and I've specialized in the study of ancient human remains, and specifically, I'm an expert in mummies, human and animal. Um, but recently, I also finished my JD looking at primarily environmental law, social justice, environmental advocacy, and how do these things combine? Um, I've always had an interest in cultural property law and cultural heritage law, and it fascinated me that you can protect an archaeological site, you can protect a vase, you can protect a stone tool much easier than you can protect any sort of human remains that are found. Ancient, historic, modern human remains can be protected much more easily than ancient human remains. Is that better, Pierre? So I think it's really important that we talk about these forgotten people that are part of heritage. I am going to attempt to share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. Okay. So I do want to warn people that this presentation will contain images of ancient or historic human remains, and I'm only using images necessary to discuss the facts. I take the ethics of human remains, ancient and historic human remains, as well as modern, very seriously. These are people, and they need to be treated with respect. So I don't believe in the use of gratuitous images of ancient human remains. And so, as I've said, I only use these images to make a specific point as we're going along. So I want to look at specifically, what are we talking about when we're talking about human remains? This may seem really easy. If somebody walks up to you and says, what are human remains? You'd think you'd be able to answer the question, or you'd think, given my background, I should be able to answer the question, but it's not always that easy. I want to look at human remains as heritage and talk about the crimes that involve human remains. And then I want to walk you through a really fascinating case study of the so-called Buddha mummy. Some of you may have seen this in the media. It's a particularly fascinating case, both legally and from an anthropological perspective. And then we're going to talk about whether there are any solutions to how human remains are treated in the heritage perspective. So first of all, how do we define human remains? And again, you'd think this would be really simple. I've been a human remains expert for, I don't mean to age myself, but 25 plus years. And you'd think it would be very simple, both from a forensic context and an anthropological context. But in fact, it's very complex. And it depends on who's being asked and what the context of the human remains are. Unfortunately, and this is really critical, human remains are very rarely defined in legislation or in other heritage-related documents. And so they're used as human remains, but they're not specific about that. And sometimes they're even broken down as just skeletal material. So that ignores the possibility of modified human remains. That ignores the possibility of mummified human remains. So NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which in the United States relates to Indigenous human remains only, uses the phrase cultural items means human remains and, but nowhere in the act does it define human remains. In Illinois, they have a Human Skeletal Remains Protection Act, and they specify that human skeletal remains are the bones and decomposed fleshy parts of a deceased human body. Not a bad definition, but again, it doesn't allow for things like mummified bodies. And in South Australia, they talk about human remains means the body or part of the body of a person. That's probably a closer definition. In anthropology, there's currently a debate as to whether or not we should even be using the term human remains. That is offensive to some. We are currently looking for alternatives, and I'm open to suggestions if people have suggestions. I'm honestly not sure what I would use as an alternative. What we're talking about is skeletal material. We're talking about mummified tissue. We're talking about hair, but we're also talking about things like body parts and anatomical specimens, and maybe even pathological specimens that have been taken as samples and stored for long-term purposes, for analysis, whether for medical purposes, research purposes. We stop and ask ourselves whether culturally modified body parts are still considered human remains. So it was common at one point, for example, in Victorian times, to put hair in a locket. Is that considered human remains? It's common in some cultures to use the skull as a drum. You stretch skin over part of the skull. Is that considered human remains? Or is that considered an object? And the interpretation of human remains has wide cultural variation, and I think legislation and policy rarely considers the original culture to which they're attempting to apply the policy. And what I've been hearing in a lot of these sessions, and what's really excited me, is that people are considering the local groups, the local cultural groups, even displaced diaspora, as stakeholders, and encouraging, requiring their contribution to how things are being done. And I think that needs to be done more when we're talking about things like human remains legislation. What's interesting is that human remains definitions don't always include ancient human remains. So human remains that may be 300 years old or 500 years old or 10,000 years old. That gets into some very controversial areas, to say the least. I'm sorry, my computer keeps throwing my Zoom away. So what kind of heritage crime can involve human remains? Well, some of it is very obvious, things like illicit excavation and looting. This occurs far more often than you might think, particularly in places like South America, where mummified bodies are regularly sitting out in the open in the Atacama Desert. They've mummified there because of the dry, natural environment, and they're relatively accessible. There are other places, of course, where this can happen. Egypt, there are looting pits in Egypt where they find all kinds of artifacts, but occasionally we'll find either whole or partial mummified bodies. I'm aware of bodies from Akhmim, for example. And even heads and hands can be sold separately. Body parts and entire mummies will show up at auctions. And I chickened out. I had a wonderful video of a head that was for sale through heritage auctions, an Egyptian head. And it was a particularly good sales video of, highlighting all of the aspects of this Egyptian head for sale. And you too can have this conversation piece in your home. So they show up at auctions, and it's not illegal, depending on how it was acquired. You can buy and sell and trade human remains in many parts of the world, depending on how they were acquired. And as long as they were acquired prior, for example, to 1970. Human remains show up on the black market. They're sold and traded like they're baseball cards. So a museum that I worked at in Germany, my job was to study the human remains. So I would do CT scans, and then it was my job to analyze and see what I could find out about the individuals. How old were they when they died? Were they healthy? Those sorts of things. And it was difficult for me. And one of the reasons I left my job is because I heard collectors say things like, I will trade you my jade skull for your Maori tattooed head. And I wasn't comfortable with those kinds of transactions. My museum they had connections with a number of private collectors who had individual human remains and part human remains in their collection. And they wanted me to do analysis of these human remains. And I felt that that was unethical and a breach of, for example, the code of the American Association of Biological Anthropology. And the ICOM code. So I chose to leave that job in part because of those violations. Those body parts were often legitimized then by loan to the museum. So the same museum held an exhibition called Schädel Cult or Skull Cult, where they exhibited in excess of 40 human skulls in different contexts with different meanings and interpretations. And more than a third of those were on loan from private collectors, and they saw no issue with this. But these heads are then legitimized on the basis of being published in an auction catalog or a museum catalog or being on display or being included in the media. That means if they want to be traded on or sold on, they have legitimization, which is extremely problematic. And I've talked a little bit about private collectors. Boy, you know, I'm a mummy expert and I wouldn't want to own a mummy or even a part of a mummy. I've seen it. I've had the opportunity. I would never do that. But there are surprisingly a lot of people who do collect human remains, skeletal, mummified in whatever form, glass jars. I know of a collector in Copenhagen who at last count had over 100 human remains. I know of collectors in Belgium and Switzerland. These mummies are not always acquired legally. I know that there are cultural patrimony laws that prevent mummies from leaving certain parts of the world, and so they should not be part of these collections. And finally, I'm including scientific research as part of a heritage crime. Because as I've said, for example, in my position, when the remains were not acquired legally, for me, that's a heritage crime to undertake analysis and then publish that analysis, which then again lends legitimacy to those remains. Which is something I really absolutely want to avoid. Okay, so let me walk you through a case study of the so-called Buddha mummy. This is where the human remains start to appear, so brace yourself. You may well have seen the image on the left-hand side, on my screen anyway, the left-hand side. So you see a seated Buddha mummy statue, and inside that statue, when it was CT scanned, is the skeleton of an individual. Now, the researchers that did the work maintain that they didn't know, and the owner didn't know, that there was a human inside when they acquired the Buddha, and that it was such a great surprise, and yet it was included or asked to be included in a mummy exhibition prior to the analysis, so clearly they knew there was a mummy inside there. The analysis revealed the name of the individual as Zhang Gong Zushi, and we know a little bit about this individual and where he came from. I think the image on the right is particularly interesting. Although the mummy was first displayed and studied at an exhibition in the Netherlands, it then moved to Budapest in Hungary. And they felt such an emotional connection to this individual that they organized prayer vigils, round-the-clock prayer vigils at the Buddha, so that the Buddha wasn't alone and so that they would be able to pray there. And so the museum created an environment for them that allowed them to do that. So the mummy was actually taken from Puzhou Temple in Fujian province, in this area just south of Jiamin. And just to run you through a quick timeline, this is an incredibly complex case that's been going on for decades. But in December 1995, villagers reported that their statue was stolen in the dead of night. It was there one day, gone the next. In 1996, a man by the name of Oscar van Overeem, a Dutch collector who has other human remains in his collection, purchased the Buddha statue in Hong Kong. There aren't a lot of details of the transaction. He maintains that he didn't know there was a mummy inside at the time of purchase. It's unclear how the mummy made its way from China to Hong Kong, but from Hong Kong, it made its way to the Netherlands, where it was part of Van Overeem's collection. It stayed, basically hidden for several years. And then in 2014, Van Overeem loaned the mummy to the Drents Museum in Northern Netherlands for an exhibition on mummies. That's where the analysis work was done. And where I lost a certain amount of respect for colleagues that I had respect for when they did the analysis. Early in 2015, that mummy moved to the Budapest Museum as an extension of the same exhibition. And within days, the Chinese, they published the images that you saw of the CT scan. Within days, the Chinese villagers saw it in the media and said, hey, wait a minute, we know this Buddha, this is our mummy, this is our Buddha, and we want our Buddha back. By March 2015, negotiations had been going on behind the scenes, and the Dutch collector says, sure, yeah, I'll give you back your Buddha, no problem, except he didn't. And so the villagers mounted a legal case, both in China and the Netherlands, to get their mummy back. This is not as easy as it sounds. There are no international laws to make this work easily at all. There are cultural patrimony laws in China that prevent this type of heritage from leaving the country, that alone should be sufficient for the return, but wasn't. And in December 2018, which is a long time for a court case to work its way through the system, there were some negotiations going on behind the scenes, but the Amsterdam court said it wouldn't hear the case because it felt the Chinese villagers didn't have standing in the case, that they didn't have the right in this case to request the mummy back in the court. By December 2020, the Sanming Intermediate Court in China ruled that under Chinese law, the statue had to be returned. It was Chinese law, not Dutch law, that ruled over the ownership of the statue. And ownership of human remains is a completely separate discussion that I'm not going to get into today. You could, we'll have tea, we'll chat. I'll bore you to death over that. And then just last week, 19th of July, 2 weeks ago, the Chinese court ordered Van Overeem to return the Buddha to China. Now, during this time, Van Overeem had repeatedly said, I'll give it back to you, but you've got to put it in a bigger temple and you've got to say that it's technically mine, but I'm letting you have it back. All kinds of mediations, all of which failed spectacularly. So 2 weeks ago, the Chinese court said, wait, that's it, we're done. Give us back our Buddha. It goes back to its original temple, belongs to the villagers. I have to note that since the villagers made the request to have the mummy back, it hasn't been seen since. Van Overeem drove immediately to Budapest, picked it up, and took it to an undisclosed location. We believe it's in a free port in either Switzerland or Belgium. He had associations with both. So at this point, nobody knows where the mummy is. Van Overeem says he sold it on. We don't know. He has no proof of that sale. I don't know what kind of proof you would have. So I think we have to talk about the fact that that mummy will probably never go back to China. It's secure somewhere. Somebody has it, but it won't go back to China. So what are the legal solutions to protect human remains? Well, internationally, laws can address import and export through patrimonial laws. They can address repatriation. They can address the protection of archaeological resources, although again, human remains are frequently excluded, and they can address indigenous objects. And laws will frequently address specifically cultural and indigenous objects, but not a wider framework outside of that. Primarily, it's for the protection or establishment of a national or cultural identity, or to address things like colonialization. And we know a lot of this. We've talked about things like Benin bronzes and so on. So aside from the context of indigenous people, human remains are frequently not specifically addressed. This is a problem. And most heritage and cultural property and cultural patrimony laws balance property interests against heritage interests, and occasionally will consider scientific interests. The person that I work with is a property attorney, and so he views human remains as an object, whereas I view human remains as people. And I assure you that leads to some fascinating discussions, particularly over the dinner table, because he's my husband. And so we don't always see eye to eye on how these things should be dealt with in the law. But there are ways of dealing with it if the body is an object, perhaps. Are there other potential solutions? Maybe. I see education as a solution, both locally and on a wider scale. So regionally, nationally, internationally, we have to talk to people about human remains education. I think we need more stakeholder involvement, particularly at the local level. We need to be talking to the cultures, the individuals involved, and see how they want to address things. I think we need to be looking more at free port holdings. Switzerland, Belgium, now the UK is going to become a major free port holding area after Brexit. I think we need to be looking more at private collectors than that underground market. Often that's done for things like pottery, but not often done for things like human remains, and that has to be extended. And I think we need to take more consideration of human remains, less as objects, sorry dear, but more as intangible heritage. That is, for who they are to the people from which they come. So as a family member, as a soul, as a being, they are intangible, not just the physical remains. So just in conclusion, I just want to wrap up with saying human remains are people, or are they, depending on who you ask. And if you want to get into that debate more, we do have a paper out, a 2017 paper on that. If you cannot find that and you might have a hard time, let me know and I can send you a copy. I think we need broader definitions of what human remains are, and we need them in heritage documents. We need that to be specified in heritage documents, human remains and what human remains represent. It's vital that we have more transdisciplinary cooperation. Call an anthropologist. We're actually very nice people, most of us. Consider including a lawyer when writing your heritage documents. Consider the stakeholder communities. It's got to be much more transdisciplinary, and I'm seeing more of that, but it needs to be expanded. I think we need more awareness of both the tangibility and intangibility of human remains in heritage crimes. We have to widen our perspectives on that. And I really, really think there's a desperate need for an improved legal protection at all levels of government, local, regional, national, international. I recognize pipe dream, pipe dream, pipe dream. But, you know, a girl can dream. And I will